A Russian tank clanks down a dirt road. Ukrainian soldiers received intel that the enemy would use this route to reach their next objective. The Ukrainian soldiers wait to spring their ambush while they laugh as they see an obsolete Soviet-era tank appear over the crest of a hill. Since the war began, Ukrainian forces have destroyed or captured hundreds of Russia's best tanks. These ancient machines have been brought out of mothball storage to fill out the ranks of Russia's armored forces after the devastating losses it saw in the first few months of fighting. How did Russia find itself in such a predicament, and where have all its tanks gone? In our scenario, the Ukrainian strike force sights the tank using their FGM-148 Javelin. At that very moment, the tank comes to a stop. The turret begins to swivel, facing directly at the Ukrainian strike force. They've been spotted. The commander shouts the order to fire. The Javelin's missile launches into the sky. There's a loud click as the T-62 tries to fire, but the shell jams in the barrel. Time and neglect have rendered the tank almost entirely useless. A few seconds later, the Javelin falls from the heavens and detonates on top of the Russian tank. Another piece of armor bites the dust as the Ukrainian soldiers pack up their gear and head to the next target. There are very practical reasons why Russia has run out of modern tanks and has been forced to use their Cold War stockpiles to pad their army. We'll talk about all of them as this show progresses. This type of scenario has played out across the Ukrainian battlefield since the invasion of the country began back in February 2022. Putin really believed that Russia could just roll across the border and claim Ukraine as its own, but this is not what happened. At the beginning of the conflict, Russia boasted it had over 2,800 tanks. Yet now we're seeing old armored vehicles being brought out of storage to replenish the Russian battalions. Hundreds of Soviet-era tanks have been loaded onto rail cars and carried to the front lines. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the main tanks being used were the T-72s, which were already decades old. Newer tanks have also been deployed, but in nowhere near the same numbers as the T-72. Before the war began, military advisors warned Putin that if the full might of the Russian military wasn't deployed in the initial invasion, they might run into trouble later on. And this is exactly what happened. The hit-and-run tactics the Ukrainian forces engaged in allowed them to not only destroy Russian tanks, but capture them and repurpose the vehicles for their own use. And as we quickly approach a year since the conflict began, it's becoming more and more clear just how much trouble Russia is in. The fact was made abundantly clear when a video surfaced of the precursor to the T-72 being taken out of storage and deployed to the front lines. The tank that is now making an appearance in the war is the T-62, which is all but obsolete. This choice of an ancient tank is surprising, as Russia has somewhere around 10,000 tanks in storage, many of which are newer than T-62s. So why is Russia bringing one of its oldest tanks out of retirement? The answer to this question is so embarrassing even Putin must know how dumb he looks. The Russians have hundreds and even thousands of T-64s, T-72s, T-80s, and T-90s, all of which are newer than the T-62s. But that's the problem. The tanks have been neglected for so long that the newer models, which have more sophisticated components, need massive amounts of repairs. However, T-62s were built using Soviet-era technology and have fewer electronics and moving parts. The simplicity of the T-62 has allowed some of them to last for decades without needing the maintenance that modern tanks require. Many of the more sophisticated tanks that came after the 62s are believed to be beyond repair. Another factor the T-62s have going for them is that Russia has a huge number of them in storage. The sheer number of these tanks constructed during the height of the Cold War likely means that at least a few were found without too much corrosion or rust damage. Even more unfortunate for Russia is the fact that their most advanced tank to date, the T-14 Armata, has not even begun rolling off the assembly line in any meaningful numbers yet. Several years ago, Russia planned on purchasing thousands of these tanks to serve as their main armored force in future conflicts. However, production never began. Putin ordered more tanks to be built, but it's too late. Harsh sanctions and a lack of resources have brought the T-14 production to a standstill. The fact that Russia is now deploying tanks that were starting to be retired in 1975 does not bode well for their war effort. There are several reasons that Vladimir Putin and his army are now scrambling to find ways to replenish their armored division. Much of it has to do with Ukrainian doctrine and their refusal to give up their country. But Russia itself has made some huge mistakes, which they're now paying for dearly. Things are even worse than they appear for Russia as they begin pulling old tanks out of deep storage. When tanks like the T-62 were retired, they were put in huge warehouses or parked outside, where the elements quickly began to corrode them. Even the tanks that were sealed away in large structures were never taken care of. This means that pickings are slim, as the Russian military scours the thousands of decommissioned tanks for ones that'll work well enough to send to the front lines. Russia is currently facing a tank crisis as they put more retired tanks on the front lines. However, it's only a matter of time before this leads to a catastrophe, as they'll eventually run out of working tanks altogether. It's theorized that the Soviet-era tanks are being deployed just long enough for new tanks to roll off assembly lines. But as we know, these new tanks may never come. This has led to a real crisis for the Russian military. It's pulled back and dug in along the territory it already controls in the Donbas region, so the troop numbers, supplies, and armor can be replenished. It's estimated that Ukrainian forces have destroyed at least 4 Russian tanks a day since the conflict began. Obviously, on days when there's intense fighting, more tanks are lost than when there's a lull. However, recent estimates suggest the Russian military has lost over 8,400 vehicles and pieces of equipment since the conflict began. This includes around 1,500 tanks, which have either been completely destroyed or captured by the Ukrainian forces. At this point, Russian military officials must be incredibly embarrassed and afraid for their lives. Putin does not take too kindly to failure, and these numbers suggest the invasion has been a huge failure thus far. As Russia starts replenishing its battalions with obsolete tanks, the numbers of losses will only increase for Russia. Less advanced tanks make easier targets, which means the Ukrainian military can keep using the same tactics, while simultaneously taking out even more of Russia's armored divisions. What makes Ukrainian troops so effective against Russian tanks? Some of the reasons are pretty obvious, while others are almost unbelievable. A big part of the Ukrainian military success has to do with the quality of their weapons. Ukraine is by no means fully stocked with the weapons and gear they need. They're constantly pleading with NATO to send them more military aid, including anti-tank weapons. As the next phase of the war begins, Ukraine will need to prepare for another Russian push forward. And as things stand now, it looks like Russia will launch another attack using tanks and artillery after they bombard major cities and Ukraine's infrastructure with missiles and kamikaze drones. Thus far, Ukraine has made do with what it has. One of the weapons that have been effective in reducing the number of Russian tanks on the battlefield is the US-made FGM-148 Javelin. Since the war began, the United States has supplied Ukrainian forces with over 4,000 javelins, with more said to be shipped into the country in the coming months. What makes these weapons so effective against any type of tank is the way the missile is deployed. A single Ukrainian soldier can fire a javelin and destroy a tank. That's pretty staggering, as without this weapon it could take a whole unit and some heavy artillery to stop a Russian tank from rolling across the battlefield. The javelin's missile launches an arc that allows it to strike at the top of the tank where the armor is the weakest. This means that every time a javelin is fired in Ukraine, there's a good chance it'll either immobilize or severely damage the Russian tank. Even the most advanced tanks that have reactive armor to absorb a missile's impact don't stand a chance against the javelin. This is because the missiles are fitted with 2 warheads. The first detonates to damage the disruptive armor, so when the second warhead goes off, all of its power goes into the chassis of the tank. This 1-2 punch is devastating for any armored vehicle struck by the missile, which is one of the main reasons Russian tanks are not faring so well against Ukrainian troops. Britain is also sending the next-generation light anti-tank weapons to Ukraine to supplement the javelins that the United States has shipped. The thousands of anti-tank weapons that have already been distributed to Ukrainian troops have allowed them to put a sizable dent in the number of tanks Putin is able to field. Unfortunately for Russia, the British in-laws and the US javelins will be even more effective against their outdated Soviet-era tanks currently being sent to replenish their dwindling armored divisions on the front lines. The United States also plans to send a contingent of Switchblade anti-tank drones to Ukraine in the near future. These kamikaze drones will target Russian tanks and reduce their numbers even further. The Russians have been using HESA Shahed-136 drones made by the Iranian company Shahed Aviation Industries to target Ukrainian infrastructure, so it'll be interesting to see how they like it when their tanks are continuously blown up by the same technology they've used to strike against Ukrainian infrastructure. Ukrainian troops, high-tech anti-tank weapons, and well-executed missions are the main reasons why Russia is running out of tanks. Ukrainian soldiers are destroying them faster than Russia can make them, which is not what Putin expected. However, there are a few other factors that are leading the rapid decline in Russian tank numbers, and the only one Russia can blame for this is themselves. Russia's tactics when using tanks are a mess. The most common makeup for a Russian unit is known as a battalion tactical group. This consists of a company of tanks, infantry, and artillery, which doesn't seem like a bad combination at first, but Russia has really messed up the numbers of each within the unit. More often than not, these battalions are made up of mostly armored vehicles and tanks, with a small contingent of troops tacked on for protection. Battalion tactical groups are really good at moving quickly, packing a punch, and hitting a target hard. However, if they come under attack, they're highly vulnerable. Ukrainian forces have exploited this flaw in the Russian battle plan by waiting for a battalion tactical group to pass by and ambushing them. Using javelins or other anti-tank measures is relatively easy against these Russian units because there are no troops to support the armor. Ukrainian infantry can hide within densely structured areas where the tanks can't maneuver well, which gives them the upper hand. If Russian commanders included more infantry in the battalion tactical groups, these exposed tanks might have a chance against Ukraine's guerrilla tactics. This would be highly beneficial for tanks operating in urban areas or locations where the terrain limits maneuverability. However, Russia still hasn't modified its tactics to take these things into consideration. Therefore, Ukrainian troops continue to incapacitate or destroy Russian tanks that don't have the support they need to successfully fight the types of battles being waged in Ukraine. Along with having battalions without proper support, Russian tactics have another fatal flaw. Before sending tanks into battle, it's important to survey the area using drones or aircraft. However, Russia doesn't seem to be doing this, which has allowed Ukrainian troops to get into striking positions along the routes Russian tanks are using. Ukraine has kept Russia from claiming complete air superiority in the region, which has definitely helped its tank-destroying efforts. Their units take out several tanks at a time and then fall back to prepare for the next fight. These hit-and-run tactics are working like a charm and causing massive losses for the Russians. However, if Russia starts conducting flyovers before moving their tanks into position, it could save a lot of armor from being lost. Recent reports by defense intelligence agencies suggest Russia's moving away from its traditional battalion tactical groups as they finally realized how ineffective they are. But it's a little too late, as the Russian army has already lost hundreds of tanks as a direct result of using BTGs. It's unclear why it took so long for Russia to leverage its numbers and make changes to its unit structure, but it likely has to do with our next point. Besides good Ukrainian tactics and poor Russian tactics, there's another even more awkward reason why Russia is running out of tanks: incompetence. Data collection conducted by independent organizations has suggested that somewhere around half the tanks Russia has lost during the war have either been abandoned or captured. Most experts believe this is due to the incompetence of Russian soldiers. To be fair, it's not entirely their fault. Many of the Russians fighting in Ukraine were just conscripted before the invasion and don't have any battle experience. This factor, on top of very little training, is a recipe for disaster. This has led to entire tank crews abandoning their vehicles and running for their lives. The craziest part is that abandoned tanks are not always the result of Ukrainian ambushes or even fighting breaking out. Some of the Russian tanks that Ukraine recovered were deserted because they had run out of fuel. Think about that for a moment. A war machine worth millions of dollars left for the enemy to capture because it ran out of gas. That brings wartime incompetence to a whole new level. It's almost as if Russian soldiers don't care if they win the war or not, which might be closer to the truth than Putin or anyone in his government wants to admit. Last spring, tanks got stuck in the mud as the snow melted. Regardless of the risks, the Russian high command ordered the tank battalions to push forward in these conditions. The results were inevitable. Many tanks became bogged down to the point they couldn't be pulled out of the muck and were abandoned. So it appears the incompetency of the Russian military runs all the way through the ranks. It's these unbelievably dumb decisions that have led to hundreds of tanks being captured by Ukraine. And once the ground hardens and the gas tanks are filled up again, these war machines can be used by Ukrainian forces to fight the very country that built them. But it's not just low fuel and bad decisions that have led to dwindling tank numbers. Since many of the Russian soldiers did not receive the proper training they should have, tanks have been driven into ditches, resulting in their tracks coming off. However, rather than fixing the problem and making sure the tank doesn't fall into enemy hands, Russian soldiers have just left them behind. It's quickly becoming apparent the loss of tanks is as much the fault of the Russians as it is of the Ukrainian forces. Perhaps the most absurd thing of all is that Russian tanks have been even seen driving off bridges when their operators lost control of the vehicle. In this particular situation, the tanks can rarely be salvaged, but abandoned Russian equipment has become so common during the war that the Ukrainian government even issued a national instruction on what citizens should do if they come across abandoned Russian vehicles or gear. The government was also nice enough to inform their people that any Russian equipment they confiscate does not need to be declared on their taxes, which is absolutely wild. The way the Russian military handles their tanks seems more like something out of a wartime comedy than an actual war. However, the continued invasion of Ukraine is no laughing matter. As the winter months continue, Ukraine desperately needs more weapons to fight against this next wave of Russian attacks. Currently, Russian forces have pulled back to lick their wounds and replenish their numbers. After months of fighting, more than 100,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or injured. The Ukrainian people have been battling bravely, but if they do not receive the support they need, Russia will eventually be able to throw enough men and outdated weapons at them to cause greater destruction and loss. Right now, we know the Russian tank numbers are so low that they're bringing Soviet-era tanks out of retirement. These models might be obsolete, but at this point Russia doesn't have a choice. More tanks are being built and will hit the front lines when they're completed, which is why it's vital that Ukrainian forces have weapons to defend against them. Right now, most of the damage being done to Ukrainian infrastructure is by missiles and drones striking power stations and factories. This has left much of the population without any energy or heat. The brutal war that Russia has started will not end as long as Vladimir Putin is in power. And since the psychopathic dictator has a stranglehold on the country and the people in it, the war will likely continue into the coming months regardless if Russia's tank numbers continue to decline. The scary thing is if Russia finds itself running low on tanks and other conventional weapons, what will they decide to do next? If Putin can't replenish his battalions with new or even old tanks, will he consider launching tactical nukes? This is a terrifying thought, but Vladimir Putin is a terrifying man, as he could start a nuclear war at any moment in time. For right now, Ukrainian troops appear to be able to deal with Russia's tanks and are even in control of many of them. Ukrainian tactics and Russian incompetence are the main reason why Russia is currently running out of armored vehicles and scrambling to bring outdated tanks out of storage. When the winter ends and the ground begins to thaw from the spring sunshine, it'll be interesting to see how many Soviet-era tanks are left stuck in the mud for Ukrainians to find.